Constitutional protections often weaken quietly through procedural interpretations rather than direct legislative changes.
The Fourth Amendment depends heavily upon courts interpreting reasonableness through evolving institutional pressures.
Legal exceptions frequently emerge gradually beneath ordinary administrative routines and procedural accommodations. Search authority expands incrementally whenever institutional efficiency receives stronger judicial protection than privacy. Every constitutional safeguard eventually encounters pressure from investigative urgency and prosecutorial administrative burdens. Warrants represent formal promises limiting government intrusion through neutral judicial oversight and documentation.
Public confidence often depends upon appearances of procedural fairness more than constitutional complexity.
Trials rely upon evidence already filtered through complicated procedural decisions made long beforehand. Most constitutional disputes begin inside paperwork rather than dramatic confrontations or public courtroom declarations. Institutional memory shapes legal culture through repetitive routines normalized across generations of legal professionals.
Documentation frequently determines constitutional legitimacy more decisively than underlying investigative intentions or outcomes.
Government authority often expands quietly through procedural reinterpretations rather than explicit constitutional amendments. Time transforms controversial judicial exceptions into normalized procedural assumptions within institutional legal practice.
Evidence preservation procedures rarely reveal deeper constitutional compromises embedded beneath investigative administrative routines.
Ordinary households encounter constitutional doctrine only after government investigations disrupt private domestic stability.
Financial vulnerability frequently limits meaningful resistance against complex procedural assertions made by state authorities. Citizens often learn constitutional ideals long before understanding institutional exceptions governing practical enforcement realities. Communities experience constitutional erosion gradually through accumulated procedural outcomes affecting familiar local families.
Caseload volume frequently compresses constitutional analysis into rapid administrative decisions and negotiated outcomes. Many citizens assume constitutional protections operate consistently regardless of procedural complexity or institutional convenience. Local conversations about justice usually emerge after visible enforcement actions disturb ordinary community routines. Procedural legal disputes often remain emotionally distant until directly affecting personal family stability and employment. Search procedures become personal immediately once government authority crosses private residential thresholds without warning. Institutional symbolism frequently obscures complicated legal doctrines, shaping real investigative power and constitutional limitations. Housing insecurity often intensifies pressure surrounding criminal accusations and procedural investigative disputes.
Minor legal complications frequently expose individuals to larger procedural systems difficult to meaningfully challenge.
Legal precedent accumulates slowly through technical decisions rarely noticed outside professional judicial communities. Institutional confidence depends heavily upon public belief that procedural safeguards remain consistently enforceable. Investigations frequently begin with fragmented observations, interpreted rapidly under uncertain field conditions by responding officers.
Initial evidence collection often shapes future legal assumptions before independent judicial review occurs.
Ordinary household objects frequently acquire procedural significance once incorporated into investigative evidentiary narratives by authorities. Field interpretations frequently solidify into formal investigative assumptions, difficult later to meaningfully challenge within courtrooms.
Administrative databases increasingly influence investigative trajectories before direct evidence independently confirms underlying suspicions or allegations.
Crime scene organization visually reinforces assumptions regarding investigative certainty and procedural legitimacy for subsequent legal proceedings. Warrant approvals often occur quickly amid overwhelming caseload pressure and repetitive procedural familiarity within chambers. Judicial authorization frequently depends upon incomplete summaries prepared rapidly by investigating officers seeking immediate operational approval. Search execution transforms abstract judicial paperwork into direct physical government presence inside private domestic spaces. Neighbors frequently interpret visible police activity as confirmation of underlying criminal guilt before formal proceedings begin. Operational planning prioritizes efficiency and officer safety, while constitutional scrutiny remains largely procedural and retrospective. Search scope frequently expands practically beyond original assumptions once investigators encounter ambiguous household materials during execution.
Procedural compliance often appears voluntary despite overwhelming situational imbalance between citizens and coordinated state authority.
Physical evidence begins accumulating institutional credibility immediately after entering official custodial documentation systems. Scientific procedures frequently reinforce investigative assumptions already established through earlier field interpretations and warrant applications.
Chain of custody documentation creates institutional confidence through repetitive verification and administrative procedural consistency.
Minor clerical inconsistencies occasionally conceal larger constitutional deficiencies underlying investigative authorization procedures and judicial approval. Storage systems transform disputed investigative materials into formally recognized prosecutorial evidence awaiting courtroom introduction and interpretation.
Measurement procedures provide numerical certainty supporting broader narratives constructed during earlier investigative decision-making stages. Authenticity verification rarely addresses deeper constitutional validity surrounding underlying investigative assumptions and judicial reliance. Scientific imaging procedures frequently distance constitutional disputes from practical evidentiary outcomes presented before juries.
Case preparation often prioritizes evidentiary admissibility over examining foundational constitutional weaknesses within investigative procedures.
Defense challenges frequently depend upon uncovering technical inconsistencies buried beneath extensive procedural documentation and investigative assumptions.
Suppression disputes determine whether constitutional violations meaningfully affect prosecutorial evidentiary strategies and trial outcomes.
Objective laboratory findings often oversham procedural concerns regarding how investigators originally obtained contested evidence materials.
Spatial inconsistencies occasionally reveal investigative exaggerations embedded subtly within warrant affidavit descriptions and operational summaries.
Judicial review often balances constitutional purity against institutional concerns regarding investigative practicality and administrative efficiency.
Procedural systems depend upon appearances of reliability regardless of underlying constitutional ambiguity surrounding evidence acquisition methods.
Suppression hearings examine whether constitutional violations require meaningful evidentiary consequences for prosecutors and investigators.
Government attorneys frequently emphasize investigative reasonableness over strict procedural compliance during suppression litigation and appellate arguments.
Procedural disputes rarely involve factual innocence directly, instead addressing constitutional limits governing evidence collection methods.
Appellate precedent frequently shapes suppression outcomes more decisively than individual factual circumstances surrounding contested investigations.
Courtroom ritual reinforces institutional authority while constitutional interpretation unfolds through technical procedural arguments and motions.
Suppression requests challenge whether procedural mistakes invalidate resulting searches and seized evidentiary materials under constitutional doctrine. Government arguments frequently stress officer reliance upon judicial authorization rather than intentional constitutional misconduct or deception.
Legal records preserve procedural reasoning that later appellate courts analyze for constitutional consistency and institutional coherence. Technical warrant defects occasionally expose broader investigative assumptions unsupported by independently verified factual evidence or testimony.
Judges frequently weigh constitutional deterrence against practical consequences affecting broader criminal prosecution systems and administrative workloads.
The good faith doctrine reframed suppression analysis around reasonable institutional reliance instead of constitutional purity.
Constitutional language remains unchanged, while judicial interpretations gradually redefine practical protections and enforcement boundaries.
Most jurors encounter evidence without understanding prior constitutional disputes shaping admissibility and investigative legality determinations.
Suppression rulings often determine trial trajectories long before testimony reaches jurors or public observers.
The doctrine shifted constitutional focus toward officer intent rather than unlawful governmental intrusion itself.
Training materials increasingly emphasize procedural compliance sufficient to preserve evidentiary admissibility during prosecutorial review.
Critics argued reasonable mistakes gradually normalize weakened protections against unjustified governmental intrusion into private spaces.
Standardized investigative language sometimes obscures individualized factual scrutiny required for meaningful judicial oversight and constitutional review.
Denied motions rarely attract public attention despite substantially shaping constitutional enforcement practices and investigative incentives nationwide. Procedural inconsistencies often survive judicial scrutiny when courts perceive investigators acted with reasonable institutional reliance.
Government reasoning increasingly frames suppression as costly administrative punishment rather than constitutional necessity protecting citizens.
The exclusionary rule now operates selectively whenever courts recognize sufficiently reasonable investigative procedural mistakes by authorities. Appellate courts frequently prioritize systemic stability when balancing constitutional enforcement against prosecutorial practical burdens and institutional efficiency. Complex constitutional exceptions often become normalized educational foundations for future legal professionals and investigators nationwide.
Investigative culture adapts quickly whenever courts reduce practical consequences for procedural constitutional deficiencies and documentation errors.
Suppression limitations disproportionately affect defendants lacking resources for extensive constitutional litigation and investigative review procedures. Institutional permanence often conceals evolving constitutional interpretations occurring quietly through appellate procedural refinements and exceptions. Institutional permanence often conceals evolving constitutional interpretations occurring quietly through appellate procedural refinements and exceptions.
Trial outcomes often depend upon evidence surviving earlier suppression disputes involving constitutional procedural limitations and judicial exceptions.
Convictions frequently persist despite acknowledged procedural flaws whenever courts recognize reasonable investigative reliance and institutional good faith. Administrative closure often arrives long before constitutional questions receive broader public examination or institutional reconsideration. Appeals rarely revisit factual guilt directly, focusing instead upon procedural constitutional interpretation and doctrinal consistency questions. Years frequently separate initial investigations from final appellate clarification regarding constitutional procedural disputes and evidentiary admissibility. Constitutional litigation often continues quietly long after public attention surrounding original investigations has disappeared completely.
Physical locations remain unchanged, while constitutional interpretations governing previous searches evolve through subsequent appellate rulings and doctrine.
Historical rulings reveal gradual expansion of exceptions limiting practical enforcement of constitutional procedural safeguards over decades.
Final procedural decisions often arrive quietly without resolving broader public concerns regarding constitutional fairness and governmental accountability. Legal institutions preserve continuity partly through gradual acceptance of evolving constitutional procedural interpretations and judicial doctrines.
Earlier constitutional standards impose stronger evidentiary consequences for unlawful searches and defective warrants than contemporary doctrine.
Constitutional actors frequently view procedural flexibility as necessary for maintaining effective investigative and prosecutorial operational systems.
Time gradually transforms controversial constitutional exceptions into accepted foundations of ordinary legal administrative practice. Procedural records continue documenting constitutional compromises long after individual prosecutions conclude and public memory fades. Courtrooms eventually return to silence while constitutional interpretations continue influencing unseen investigative practices nationwide. Technological efficiency increasingly accelerates procedural approvals, shaping future constitutional search and seizure disputes across jurisdictions. Digital systems streamline investigative authorization while preserving long-standing constitutional debates surrounding reasonable governmental reliance doctrines. Students inherit constitutional frameworks already shaped by decades of procedural exceptions and judicial balancing tests. Resource limitations continue influencing which constitutional challenges receive sustained litigation and meaningful appellate examination nationwide.
Institutional systems routinely discard procedural disputes once cases conclude and administrative objectives are satisfied fully.
Policy manuals increasingly codify constitutional exceptions developed originally through narrow appellate procedural reasoning and judicial accommodation. New precedent rarely eliminates older doctrine completely, instead layering additional procedural exceptions and qualifications incrementally. Constitutional disputes leave lasting personal consequences extending far beyond abstract appellate legal reasoning and institutional efficiency concerns.
Judicial restraint often reflects concern regarding institutional stability and administrative functionality within complex criminal justice systems.
Reasonableness standards continue expanding through ordinary procedural decisions issued quietly by reviewing appellate courts nationwide. Constitutional protections frequently depend upon procedural enforcement mechanisms vulnerable to gradual institutional limitation and reinterpretation. The good faith doctrine preserved evidence despite acknowledged procedural defects within judicially approved warrant processes and searches.
Constitutional safeguards remain active only when institutions accept meaningful consequences for governmental procedural mistakes.